The Athletic.
The race is on, and Carlos Sainz took his and Ferrari's first victory of the season in Australia after Max Verstappen was undone by brake troubles, while Fernando Alonso was given a penalty for driving in a potentially dangerous manner. But would it have been business as usual had Red Bull not hit trouble? I'm Ed Straw, and joining us to answer that question and many more are Mark Hughes and Samarth Kanal. Well, Mark, we've been in Australia for the past week. We did the earlier podcast where we got together before the race. This has lived up to expectations, hasn't it? The Australian Grand Prix is always a great fun event.
It is, yeah. It's just a lovely venue, especially when the sun's shining. And it's almost a bonus when you get a good race. And this one, it wasn't vintage, but it certainly had its moments. And it gave us that nice break in the previous routine of outcomes.
Absolutely. It's not about Max Verstappen not winning, because don't want to see them doing well, but it's just good to have variety. You always want as much variety as possible. And Samarth, I think this is your first Australian Grand Prix on site, isn't it? Or have I got the details
100%.
wrong?
Yeah, so I'm not waking up at 5 a.m. in my pokey bedroom in London and turning on the computer all bleary-eyed. I'm bleary-eyed and it's daytime. So it's quite nice to be out, but it's lovely in Melbourne. It's been, a really great weekend, really interesting. And it's actually one of the tracks I don't think gets enough credit. I think it's an interesting track. I think it's an interesting circuit. People forget it is a street circuit. So lots going on. It was an interesting race for sure. As Mark said, I'm not sure if it was one for the ages, but it was really interesting for sure.
Yeah, all about storylines. There's plenty of storylines for us to get into in this podcast. So, Mark, let's get into it with the usual question. So how did the Australian Grand Prix play out?
Well, it played out in a way that it was dominated by the retirement of Max Verstappen. For the brake caliber was not releasing properly from the disc, which, as you probably saw, caused a big fire on the back of the car. And that was left the way clear for Carlos Sainz in the Ferrari. But I think it was a shame in a way that Verstappen did retire, because every indication was that Sainz could have run with Verstappen here. And the Ferrari was genuinely good with the tyres, because the main constraint with the tyres this weekend was graining on all three compounds. And it wasn't the usual heat deck that was determining the level of the different cars. It was how well they were controlling the graining. And the last time we had a race like that, you might remember, was Las Vegas last year. And again, the Ferrari was very good then. It was only an inopportunely timed safety car that lost Leclerc that race. And this is a much better Ferrari than that one, even relative to the Red Bull, having improved. So I think there was nothing to suggest that the Red Bull had better tyre deg, because it wasn't being limited by the thermal things as it usually is, but was by the graining. And Sainz, and particularly Sainz, but the Ferrari in general, but particularly Sainz, had a very good handle on that, and that was clear from as early as Friday. And Red Bull had a scrappy Friday. Although they'd got the car in some sort of sweet spot by the end of qualifying, it was, still it wasn't a vintage Red Bull Verstappen performance. So they were scratching a little bit. And I think there was every indication that this would have been a really, really close contest between Verstappen and Sainz. Maybe Verstappen would have won it anyway, because one of the advantages you have is clear air is an even bigger advantage when you're dealing with tyre graining, and he did win the start. But then again, Sainz was in his DRS zone and could quite conceivably have put that pass on him anyway. So yeah, I think it's a shame in a way that we lost that contest. But anyway, the outcome was that we had this lovely storyline of Sainz winning the Grand Prix. After having spent the previous 10 days in post-operation recovery in bed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a tough couple of weeks for him. He did say before the race weekend that in the first week of the recovery, there were times when he thought, there's no way I'm going to be ready for this. And then the second week, once he was in Australia, he was feeling better, still not 100%. But it's interesting, isn't it, to look at Perez's performance, because he had a fairly subdued run to fifth place. He made the comparison with Las Vegas as well and the track surface. So I guess, Samarth, we can kind of say, well, Perez was able to breeze through to P2 in the first couple of races. Much harder work here. So applying the Verstappen offset there perhaps supports the idea that maybe there could have been an interesting race if Verstappen hadn't had the problem.
Yeah, I think ironically, it probably would have been one of the races in recent memory where Verstappen's inclusion would have made it more exciting. And that's not a slight on him at all. That it is just one of those weird things. And I think, yeah, touching on what Mark's saying, Perez cited the tarmac, basically, as the issue. So it's the surface. And it's weird that it is a car trait that Red Bull will now have to look at. I'm not sure... Suzuka's completely different in this regard, isn't it? It's a high tyre wear circuit.
Very high load in terms of the lateral load, yeah.
So in terms of that, what do you think? How do you think Red Bull will fare there then? Is it a similar problem?
No, it's a more traditional problem. I think you're more likely to see the previous Red Bull pattern of the advantage increasing on race day compared to qualifying. But, who knows?
That's an admirable attempt to build up some excitement for Japan there. I like that.
Oh.
I'm sorry I batted that down a bit. But, you might be right anyway. But that's how it looks at the moment.
And the brake problem, what do we know about it? I have to admit the fact that it happened immediately and the fact that we did see in the garage Verstappen doing a little sort of pointing to his head and he seemed to say the word stupid. My lip reading skills aren't brilliant, but it sounded like it may have been some kind of mistake that led to
it sounds like a preparation problem. We do know that it was a sticking caliper on the right rear, and so it wasn't releasing fully, which gave him that funny little wiggle through turn 3 at the beginning of lap 2, which is what enabled Sainz to get a run on him. But it's also, the heat built up within the cake tins, which are sealed, so the heat's not able to escape, and you'll have seen them explode as he drove it into the pit lane. Everything's pointing to a preparation error.
And mistakes happen. It's the fact that that's so unusual for Red Bull says a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm just going to add that it doesn't smell great when you're around the vicinity of burning tyres.
You were getting in trouble for rummaging around the back of their garage, weren't you?
Yeah, that was me. Yeah, I was just trying to find a spare brake caliper for my Mazda MX-5. No, I was out there. I went out, and it was a smoking tyre, and everyone was just it was just there. It was a very surreal thing. Lots of Red Bull engineers looking at it, and Pirelli people, and no one could really touch it because it was scalding hot, but it didn't smell great, and I probably shouldn't have breathed in too much of that. But there we go. It was an interesting.
You were up close smelling it.
I wasn't there.
It?
I wasn't there to sniff it, Mark. I'm not that odd. I was just wanting to take a picture out of curiosity.
I'm surprised you got chased away.
I didn't get chased away, really. I thought it was fine.
Still let you in the paddock.
There was some gesticulation in one of your photos.
Oh, I think that guy was joking, though. I'm not sure. Yeah, there was a Red Bull engineer who was waving people away, but I think he realised that he couldn't stem the tide.
Giving up on it. But that just shows the lengths that you go to get those good photos. I'm sure we threw them up on our social media platforms somewhere. But let's talk a little bit about Carlos Sainz, because I think 16 days before winning this race, Carlos Sainz was under the knife, or to be more precise, under the laparoscope, if I've pronounce that correctly, for an appendectomy. Of course, it's basically keyhole surgery, for want of a better word. But how impressed were you with his weekend performance, both in terms of just what he did and that wider context of his recovery?
Yeah, so I think he wasn't completely comfortable. He said he was feeling stiff. So when he got into the car on Friday, there was still a question of whether he'd be able to do all the other sessions. And that's something that Fred Vasseur, team principal of Ferrari, said today. He said, Carlos wasn't 100% sure, but when he got in, it took him 2 laps to get back up to speed. And I think that underlines not only Carlos's quality, but the quality that F1 drivers have now, where they can just do that flawlessly, and how fit they are, and their recovery is excellent. And that is a testament to the motorsport as we know it, and Carlos Sainz is no different. He's one of the drivers that can just jump in, do the job, and he did it very well. It's very impressive. I don't think he put a foot wrong today. I know that Leclerc was pretty close to him, and I think they were identical. And Carlos was perhaps enjoying the free air as well, and he only finished a couple of seconds ahead of Leclerc. But he was excellent. They were both excellent. And if you add the recovery in, I'm not sure if either of you have had appendicitis, by the way.
No.
No, I can't imagine it's very fun to recover from having your insides car open, having a part of you taken out, and then jumping into an F1 car where, 4 to 5 Gs. Fred Vasseur said it was amazing. He was very happy. He did try and play down Carlos a bit, though, because he knows that he's going to start getting questions as to why he's letting Carlos go at the end of the season. So that was the interesting thing for me today.
Well, it's the funny thing, isn't it? He's the man without a drive, and he's the man of the weekend in terms of his on-track performance. And this has certainly raised the question of where he's going to end up being. But he was very interesting actually before the weekend. Sainz talking about the surgery and the recovery, and he'd spoken to Alex Albon, who told him to expect a weird feeling, and that's exactly what Sainz said he had. And he had, I think it was 3 incisions it required to do the appendectomy. So Sainz was very positive about the medical care he'd had and everything. And obviously he was very aware that he had the privilege of focusing fully on his recovery, whereas the ordinary mortals, non-elite sports people wouldn't quite have that luxury. But it was impressive. I actually ran into him as he was heading out the paddock earlier, and you could see he wasn't quite moving right. He was a little bit stiff. He was fine otherwise, but he wasn't walking in a relaxed manner, let's put it that way. But so that to me showed he wasn't 100%, as he said. And I think although it's not the most far-reaching, biggest surgery in the world, I was impressed with what he did. But it was interesting, Mark, because the comparison with Leclerc in qualifying was very interesting, and I think it underlined something about the relative merits of Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, didn't it?
Yeah, when it's a case of tracking changes over the track and the implication that has on how you're using the car and how you're driving the car and how you're using the tyres, he's always super, super sharp at that. And this was a classic case of that because the temperature variation was considerable. The way the tyres work and was the balance between the front and rear, the way you had understeer in a certain part of the lap and oversteer in a different part of the lap, and how the wind direction changed the emphasis of that, either turning it down a bit or exaggerating it. You had to be on top of all those things. Leclerc just gets in the car and just drives it, and is fantastic at doing that. And if the conditions are stable, he will find that last little bit because he's got a baseline, and then he's able to delve and just grab something deeper. The sort of thing that you used to see, Ayrton Senna do, or Michael Schumacher or Gilles Villeneuve. That he has that sort of ability where you can just go beyond on a one-off lap once he's established a baseline. But when it's changing like that all the time, you need a Sainz to be keeping on top of it, and that's how he became the cutting edge of Ferrari in qualifying. He was more on top of the situation than Charles was.
And speaking to Leclerc after qualifying, you could see he knew what the problem was because he talked about the fact that, well, I think I messed up on the tyre preparation. Everything I was doing wasn't quite clean. There was always some limitation front to the back.
Bit too much front winging in the end.
Exactly, they were trying to get the fronts working, and then you pay the price. And I think he just knew it wasn't all quite adding up. And it's probably frustrating because this happens on a semi-regular basis during their alliance at Ferrari. And I think it's one of the reasons why you would never say that bringing Lewis Hamilton in is not a positive move and not an upgrade. But Sainz brings some very good complementary skills to Leclerc, which is why I really like the balance of that lineup. So I guess the question, Samantha, is where's Sainz going to end up? He's boosted his market value yet further, hasn't he?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think he'll end up a top team, not a top team, but a competitive team. I mean, he's a top driver. That's the thing, and he's proved it today. I would hate to see him end up somewhere that isn't performing. So I think he'll end up somewhere competitive. I mean, he has to, right? The question is who will be competitive when he goes there as well. I mean, there's all that. But yeah, this is a great advert for him. I mean, surely there'll be people knocking on his door to get him now, right?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say it'll be at Red Bull.
Well, there was a little bit of Christian Horner hint in that direction, wasn't there?
There was. He was asked about Tsunoda, and he changed the question around to, well, it's not about who's in the family already. It's about putting the best combination of drivers that's possible to get. And there's one very impressive unemployed driver just right there pointing at Sainz's lap traces. So yeah, I mean, already I've been thinking logically that's where he should be looking to go, and I think the logic works on both sides.
Yeah, very much so. Obviously, he's been linked with Aston Martin. Mercedes is another vacancy. Toto Wolff was asked about him, but Wolff was very careful not to specifically address Sainz. He said, yes, he's done well, but there's a number of candidates who have a wide range of strengths. So he was being quite cautious there.
I'd also add that today, two drivers who were in line for that Red Bull seat probably didn't have the best day. Ricciardo and Perez. So they were anonymous. I know they had their issues, but yeah, that probably helped Sainz's case even more.
Absolutely. Well, you need that sort of quality. And I think particularly on these weekends where things are a bit difficult, Red Bull would potentially have benefited from having Sainz in the car, given his abilities and his mastery of that sort of thing. And at worst, Max Verstappen's a very clever driver in the way he approaches things. Why not have two drivers who can do that in your lineup? Let's now, Mark, talk about the other big talking point of the race, which was Alonso's penalty for what amounted to a brake test on George Russell. That led to Alonso being hit with a 20-second penalty that relegated him from 6th to 8th. And of course, Russell crashed. So can you explain what happened and why he was penalised?
So, yeah, at the late stages, George was faster. He was chasing him down. Going into the penultimate lap, they came up to turn 6.
That's stressing your counting there.
Yeah, turn 6. Alonso braked 100 metres earlier than he had at any other point in the race. And he then went back on the throttle and then braked slightly a second time, only slightly, but it was enough to sort of disorient George and catch him by surprise and make him take evasive action, and that evasive action contributed to his running off into the gravel and into the tyre barrier and onto his side. And so, Alonso, it wasn't established that he did it deliberately to make George crash, and I don't think he would have done that, but I think he was being very, very defensive.
It's about compromising the run down to the next corner, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly that. And so I think it was determined that could be classified as driving erratically, and therefore that was justification for the 20-second penalty.
Yeah, that's a violation of the International Sporting Code, of course. So do you think that's a fair cop, Mark?
I do, yes. Yeah, I do. I think that probably... It wasn't like I think dirty driving would be too strong, but it was a little bit... Yeah, it was erratic, and it shouldn't be. You should be able to rely on the other guy to at least drive safely into an accepted code, no matter if it's the last lap and it's getting a bit desperate.
I think it's file under the dark arts. I think that might be the phrase. Any dissent from you there, Samarth, on the penalty?
No, completely agree with you guys. Well, the brake issues that Alonso said he had after the race. Did you have a look at the telemetry and did you find anything there?
There were two distinct brake applications. It does look very odd. Scott Mitchell-Malm, who's following the race from afar, had dug that out and he sent that to me and I said, that doesn't look great.
Yeah, and it was also the fact that it was the first application came so early. It was like really, really early. And yeah, you can do that, but you can't just dismiss the fact there's a car with its nose right on your gearbox when you do it. So, yeah.
Yeah, just one of those things, and maybe Alonso just going that little bit too far. It's his competitive approach, isn't it? He's ruthless. He'll go to those limits, and once in a while, perhaps he goes a little bit too far. But it didn't cost him a huge amount in the end, because this wasn't a brilliant weekend for Aston Martin. So he finished 8th in the end, and Lance Stroll in the end picked up 6th place. So it didn't actually even make that big a difference to Aston Martin's points haul, but it did help Yuki Tsunoda gain a place. He finished 7th in the end. Let's move on to the other podium finisher now, Mark. The first podium finish of the season for McLaren. Lando Norris 3rd ahead of Oscar Piastri. Encouraging for the team that as the tracks move further towards the strengths of the car, then it's getting closer to the pace of Ferrari. So that's pretty positive, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And they were close enough to put some pressure on Leclerc's Ferrari. They did it very well as a team. They used the pincer movement on on them to keep applying undercut pressure on them. And you need to be quite close in performance to be able to do that. And yeah, it's, we saw Sainz had a little bit of an edge over Leclerc, but that was just a small difference, and the McLaren was nearly there on Leclerc's level. And this is a track where we think the Ferrari was probably close to the Red Bull level. So, yeah, I think this the particular demands of this track this weekend, I think, have brought those three cars closer together. And I think its only real weakness this weekend is how much it loses in the DRS zone. So in qualifying, it's maybe 4/10 off, but in the race, when you're not in the DRS zones, it's much more competitive, and it's there's always a bit of a trade-off between how much DRS do you want and how much low drag do you want when not in DRS mode, and they've chosen a certain way, but in general, the car's still good and very good in the quick stuff, and it's quite aero efficient. So, yeah, encouraging, but and I think it'll be very good at Suzuka. That's a really good circuit configuration for it. But yeah, I'm not hopeful yet of it indicating that it's on an ever upward trajectory. I think it might be a similar pattern to last year in terms of being circuit specific.
Yeah, it's looking that way. Suzuka will be interesting. Andrea Stella, their team principal, was talking about that. He said, well, this is a step from what we've seen before towards what's good for us, and Suzuka is another step. So they're interested to see where they are. But again, he talked about it's a 1 year project to tackle all their weaknesses, which includes that straight line speed deficit with the DRS open. In fact, their straight line speed with the wing closed is generally pretty good. Yeah. It's with the DRS open that they lose out, and that long slow corner weakness that's dogged them for quite a few years. And yeah, I think Norris overall was the stronger of the two McLaren drivers. Yes, Piastri was ahead and let him pass, but that was a strategic quirk because of the way they tried to take the fight to Leclerc. So I think Piastri, by his own admission, had a slightly untidy qualifying. He was a little bit disappointed, but P3, P4, that's a good result for McLaren. You can't really see them having done much better. Samarth, let's talk about Mercedes now, because George Russell would have been 7th had he not crashed on the penultimate lap. Lewis Hamilton retired with loss of oil pressure on lap 16. Hamilton was very negative, wasn't he, about where Mercedes was after qualifying. What exactly is going wrong there?
Yeah, I think Lewis Hamilton wears his heart on his sleeve, and you can kind of tell when he's not happy. And this weekend, I don't think there was a single point where he entered the media pen happy.
I enjoyed his one-word answer to your first question. He was much more eloquent after that, but
yes,
that's when you could tell.
How are you feeling after your qualifying performance? Good. Well, fair enough. I mean, brevity is the soul of wit, right? So he's done well there.
Well, you thought he'd generously given the nice soft starting question, which is just a bit of politeness.
Yeah. Well, I try and be polite. But so back to Mercedes issues. I mean, I think we were saying during pre-season testing, that Mercedes hadn't got its cards in order, and I think the case is still similar to that. I think that they still quite haven't understood why the rear is so unstable on that car. And it generally does look like quite an unstable car. I mean, Mark, I don't know if you agree with that, but it looks like the rear. And I'm not going to say that's the reason for George Russell's crash. I know there are other factors there. Actually, it looked like there was dirty air there where George Russell kind of ran off and he couldn't get the car quite turned in. And when you're in the wake of another car, that can happen. So I don't think that's because of Mercedes issues, but rear end instability seems to be the problem. And now there's an engine problem to boot.
Yeah, it's certain inconsistency in it. There were certain conditions through the weekend where it was actually quite a quick car. But as soon as the wind changed direction or it came up, suddenly the balance was gone. And then it was using the tyres in a different way and they couldn't find the sweet spot again. So it's very, very, a very tricky car, very capricious. And it's just, it seems to have them tearing the hair out. They do seem a little bit lost.
Yeah, and they can't quite run it really close to the ground. That's another problem. So, again, in corners like I'm not saying that was the reason why George crashed, but in corners like that, that's where Mercedes can really suffer. So, we're still seeing that problem. And I think preseason testing was a bit of a mess for them, really. They were trying to understand things. They were changing the suspension layout a little bit on the front to kind of aid anti-dive. And all these things speak to the fact that maybe they haven't understood this car at all, or at least the platform that they're running. And that's why they're so far behind Red Bull.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, it is clearly essentially a clean sheet. The first 2 years of this regulation set, it was essentially the same concept of car. This is a clean sheet, and Red Bull's on the third iteration of it. So yeah.
Yeah, Toto Wolff after the race he was trying to put some kind of positivity on it, but there was also a fair bit of negativity. He said we've had this physics problem for a few years, and the thing that worries me is that I don't see an end to it at this stage, because they've done a lot of work on trying to understand this. We know roughly where the problem is. They seem not to be on top of the science of the car when it's running very low to the ground, and you end up with this car that's theoretically able to work very, very well, but ultimately in the real world it doesn't correlate well. So there are all sorts of questions people are asking him about. Well, Aston Martin use your wind tunnel, do they have the same problems? And sort of going round and round, but no kind of definitive directions, because that's the question I asked Wolff. I said, right, well, you've been chasing this, so just from a management perspective, how do you shift the parameters of what's being looked for in order to find the answer? And it just paints the picture of a team that just doesn't know exactly where to look.
I'm just curious, is that no blame culture kind of line started being put out again? Because I remember when they were winning, there was a no blame culture of the team, but I wonder if that will start to shift when they continuously hit these problems.
Well, the no blame culture gets tested more when things don't go well, but I don't think you can. I don't know whether you'd agree, Mark, but I don't think you could say there's one individual who's at fault, because it's very easy to point at the technical director. James Allison is a very, very accomplished and intelligent character. He knows what he's doing, so it's not that you need to change technical leadership, but that something just needs to shift in the collective philosophy and mentality. And I think that's because the idea of the no blame culture is you blame the problem. But it's quite hard to blame the problem if you can't fully find it, or rather you can find the problem, but you can't find that root cause.
Where's it coming from? Yeah, and it could be coming from anywhere. It could be coming from simulation tools. It could be coming from where they're looking at the markers, which markers they're choosing to represent reality. And that can change from one regulation set to another, one car to another. It typically in these sort of situations, there's usually a breakthrough. There's usually a breakthrough in understanding, and quite often it's triggered by something random. It's triggered by something that just didn't add up from something else. And when you dig a bit deeper than that, then you find that. Yeah, but whether that's going to happen in the short term, this year or next year, or who knows?
Yeah, and it's complicated. This is difficult. Yeah. This is very difficult stuff. And their car's not a catastrophe. It's just uncompetitive by their standards. It's still a very quick racing car capable of getting good results, but they desperately need to find that breakthrough, because the longer you go without it, the more you just find yourself sort of grasping in the darkness for it, which is probably what it feels like at times there. Now, Mark, let's talk about the team that I was going to call AlphaTauri, but of course they're RB now, we have to call them, although whenever I mention them I have to be slightly snidey and derisive about the name. But for that team, it was very much a tale of two halves of the garage, wasn't it? Tsunoda had a very strong weekend, qualifying 8th, finishing 7th. Daniel Ricciardo, meanwhile, struggled. So what's Tsunoda doing right that Ricciardo isn't?
I mean, it's Tsunoda's basic speed has always been there, as we know. He didn't always have access to it, or couldn't always access it without having sort of wild moments. He's been around long enough now to have got rid of all that, and now you just see the speed. Now, Helmut Marko's question whether the race speed, his question is race speed, because he's sort of fallen out the points at like the first couple of races, but that could just as easily be a kart rate. The trouble is that how you benchmark him when the other driver is clearly having some sort of crisis, because that's not a Daniel Ricciardo, Red Bull era Daniel Ricciardo level of performance. That's much more like his troubled McLaren time. And, when you're whole tenths off, nearly half a second off, there's something fundamentally wrong. So you can't really measure where Tsunoda's at. And it could be that he's operating at a very, very high level. But until we see him alongside of a Verstappen or a Leclerc or something like that, it's very difficult to quantify it. And I think he's doing a good job in a car that's tidy, and it's probably the best of that second, the lower half of the field. There's a top 5 and a bottom 5 now, isn't there? And it's probably the best of that bottom 5. And he seems to be able to just squeeze a lot from it and get it into Q3 on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah, and I think certainly this weekend there's no obvious extra performance left untapped. Well, there might be a tiny bit of performance, but results-wise, I think that was probably as good as it was going to get for an RB, which is very, very positive. And certainly Daniel Ricciardo was pretty puzzled after qualifying, saying he's still a bit sceptical about the car because he did the lap. Okay, he had his lap time deleted. That meant he fell in Q1. But even then, it was a tenth slower than Tsunoda, which surprised him. And then, I was there when he saw the lap time Tsunoda did in Q2, and clearly he was slightly surprised by it, and he admitted, even with track evolution, I know I couldn't do that. And yet, I think I'm driving this car well. And normally when it feels like that, the lap time's there. So I'm a bit worried that he's got stuck in that spiral of struggle. Again, certainly he's going to need an uptick fairly soon. Samarth, Haas, their great start to the season got even better. Unexpected double points finish. So how do they go from a disappointing qualifying to Nico Hülkenberg finishing 9th and Kevin Magnussen 10th?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say it was a disappointing qualifying. I think it was Kevin Magnussen 14th and Nico Hülkenberg 16th, but he was impeded by Sergio Perez, which actually ended up shaping the race a little bit because Perez got that penalty. But Haas did really well to get points out of that, I think. And the team has made no secret, firstly, of prioritizing race pace over qualifying pace, because the logic is that, like last year, when you qualify well, you can only fall backwards if your race pace isn't good enough. Now they're trying to work on obviously not falling backwards and falling forwards, or at least staying in one space. This analogy has only got so many legs on it, so I'm just going to continue with this.
Staying upright.
Staying
on
upright.
Two legs.
It's good, yeah. So Hülkenberg started on hards, and then he pitted during the virtual safety car, which is it's not a free pit stop, it's a big advantage. That was when Hamilton had his engine failure. And then on newer tyres than Magnussen, he was sent ahead of Magnussen. They swapped the two drivers to then pick off Albon. And I think it was just a solid day for Haas. And Komatsu was pretty happy with it. But he did say that Suzuka could be really hard for the team.
That car's not great in the high speed, is it?
Yeah. And so I'm not going to say it's a false dawn. I think they've done really well to kind of get on top of the issues of last year with tyre wear. But Suzuka's a real test for tyres, and Haas in the high speed as well. So it's going to be a really tough race for them. They've done really well today, though, I must say. Really impressive.
Well, they've already picked up 4 points, which is 4 points more than some were predicting they might get all season. And that car's handy in the races. It's absolutely there. It's not suffering from those problems, so all credit to them. Let's now, Mark, talk about Williams. Big talking point this weekend. Alex Albon finished a frustrating 11th on what was a difficult weekend for that team. Of course, he damaged his chassis on Friday, which led to Logan Sargent being parked for Saturday and Sunday. Could you argue the fact Albon didn't get among the points proves it was the wrong decision and they shouldn't have deprived Logan Sargent of a car for reasons of his teammate crashing?
I wouldn't want to take on that argument in the debating society, or if I was hired to be counsel, I'd be very reluctant to take that one on. I think they did the entirely logical thing, even though it was unfortunate for Logan. I think you're fighting for very, very valuable points. That part of the constructors' table, and he's your best bet of getting 1 or 2 points. And so, yeah, he was pushing to make a mediocre do something that it was reluctant to do, and he paid the consequence, or Logan Sargent paid the consequence of Alex trying to do that. But yeah, that's just how it is, really, and that's just where the car's at. And when you get beyond the car's level so regularly as Alex does, I don't think it's fair to be critical when you occasionally go over it and have damage. I think that's perfectly okay.
Yeah, racing drivers crash. I mean, it was a bad mistake given they had no spare chassis, but mistakes happen. Albon himself after the race said, I'm not particularly happy with my weekend, obviously starting with that. But actually, if you look at his race, he got the car into the points at one stage, but it just did not have the pace. They tried to hang on to it by being aggressive with an early start, and it was just always fighting competitive gravity, wasn't it? And I think Williams made a very good choice there. They could easily have hidden from that choice, but there were points on offer for the lower down teams today, and they gave themselves the best chance by backing Albon. That's just the reality of it. But yeah, they need to get a spare chassis out. Obviously, they're patching up that one for Suzuka. They're hoping to have the third chassis, so they've got a spare for the Chinese Grand Prix that follows Suzuka. So lots of work to be done there. And now, for the third time in 3 races, it's time for a trip to a very special place.
Welcome to Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner.
And today we're sympathetic for Bottas because he was in a position to score on a weekend where he performed very well, only to have his race ruined by another Sauber pit stop disaster and finish 14th. So, Mark, what do you think Valtteri has to do to catch a break?
Yeah, it's out of his hands, isn't it? I mean, this is a fundamental engineering problem with the wheel nuts, and they're having to be redesigned. And yeah, he just happens to be in that car when the team has got this problem. And Zhou Guanyu suffered for the same problem also. So all sympathy for Valtteri, but again, as usual, nothing he could have done about it.
Yeah, it just seems to happen, doesn't it? And yeah, unfortunate for the third time this season in 3 races, Sauber had those pit stop problems. They've got some work to do. I think it's going to be a few races before they've got that solved. But yeah, actually a really good weekend, I thought, from Valtteri Bottas. He was performing very, very well. They had a new front wing on that car. Zhou's front wing was damaged in qualifying. He had to revert to the old spec. He just ran a tiny bit wide, just a tiny bit, and just damaged the wing. He was incredibly unlucky because he was on to join Bottas in Q2 before that happened. So yeah, a tough weekend for Sauber, and of course for Valtteri Bottas in Australia, very much his second home now. Well, as always, it's time now to turn the floor over to the Race Members Club for questions about the Australian Grand Prix. Thanks, as always, to our many members. And if you're interested in joining for the many benefits that includes asking questions on our race review podcasts, an ad-free environment on our website and much more, click the link in the description. And remember, you can also sign up through Apple Podcasts. Loads of questions we've received today, as we've done for the past few races. We've got some we'll save to address in the midweek podcast as well. But let's pile into what we can here. Samarth, you're first up. Oscar Robledo, regular questioner, says, does the decision by Williams to give Sargent's car to Albon spell the end of Sargent's career, and could we see a driver change this year?
Thanks, Oscar. Good question, that. I think it's going to dent his confidence quite a lot, and I think dent is a polite way to put it. That must be a really tough thing for a driver to go through. I would say maybe it's a bit far-fetched to say that we could have a driver change this year. Williams would perhaps have to pay the rest of his contract off, and it might not be worth doing that because you then have to put a new driver in this car, get them up to speed very quickly in the middle of a season. That's a very tough ask, especially if that new driver might be someone quite young. So I'd say that it won't happen this year. Could it be announced for next year? Yes, possibly, and maybe that's what the question was getting at. So I think there's every chance that Sargent he won't be at Williams next year. I just think he's struggled a bit. He's off the pace. And if the decision that James Vowles and Williams made is anything to go by, they're not that confident in his ability compared to Albon.
Yeah, the bottom line is, harsh as it is on Logan Sargent because it wasn't his fault, there's 24 race weekends of evidence prior to that decision being made that said Albon was the better bet. And Sargent, as we've talked about before, he shows flashes of promise, but has yet to really fully coalesce into realising that potential. And obviously that's what he needs to do over the rest of the season. Mark, a question from Flavio, who says, I'd love to hear more discussion about the trouble at Mercedes. More than technical difficulties, I want to know what the leadership is doing and what team morale is like at this point. This is the third year of one fiasco after another. Mercedes has reduced itself to a solid midfielder team by now.
Is this Flavio that's managing Fernando Alonso? I was wondering.
There's no hint. It doesn't say Flavio B. It doesn't say Flavio from Italy. It's unclear. It's unclear. If he'd sent in audio for the question for us to include, it would be very easy to pick out if it's the Flavio.
His question is, what is Mercedes doing?
Well, yeah, just what's the morale like? What effect is this scenario having on them?
I think everybody's probably desperately trying to find their way to the light, and I'm sure it's not a great place to be at the moment, and they will be trying very, very hard to keep a sense of unity and purpose while getting these regular dispiriting outcomes every couple of weekends. So yeah, not nice. It's just part of the competitive grind that all teams go through, and it'll make it coming out the other end, if and when that happens, feel sweeter. But it won't be an enjoyable place to be at the moment. There'll be lots of resolution and digging deep and all that, but which will ultimately should prove satisfying when it turns around. But no, I don't imagine it's much fun there at the moment.
Next question I'll take from Dave Smith, who says, what's causing Sauber's continual pit stop issues, and where would you see them in the pecking order pace-wise without them? And Andy Sally asks, can they redesign the wheel nut or possibly use last year's design? Well, the problem, it's not operator failure or anything. It's not down to the pit crew. It is down to the wheel nuts, and it's specifically the way the wheel nuts behave when the temperature rises in race conditions. It's an incredibly difficult thing to replicate. They mainly replicate it in race pit stops. They have managed to a little bit the rest of the time, but it's really frustrating for them because they did massively dial back the pit stops just to really try and make sure they were going to work. So they were going to be losing a few seconds, I think, in the pit stops, and did in the ones that went well. But still, Chevy Pujolar, their head of trackside engineering, said they'd gone through the weekend and it was going fine. And then they had the first pit stop with Bottas, and he said, and I just thought, no. So they've done what they can. And yeah, it is down to the wheel nuts, and specifically it'll be in the metallurgy of the wheel nuts. And they are going to be replaced. They are being redesigned, but it just takes time to produce them because it's not just knocking it together. You've got to make and cure these parts in clever ways. So it sounds like it's going to be 3 or 4 races before they have that proper solution in place. So it's going to be countermeasures up until then, which is very unfortunate. And of course they've upgraded their pit equipment this year, so it should be an improvement. But every time they make a pit stop, they're going to be holding their breath just in case this happens. And yeah, it's cost them points today, which is a real problem because they can't afford to leave points on the table. So Martha, question from Jack Aitken, that's the Australian Jack Aitken, who says, on an alternate timeline, is there a different pit strategy that could have got Oscar Piastri onto the home podium?
Thanks for your question, Jack. So essentially, I think Mark mentioned it earlier actually in the podcast, but Oscar Piastri was used almost to kind of not persuade. He was
Apply pressure.
Apply pressure. Let's say apply pressure. You don't persuade people during races.
He aggressively lobbied.
Lobbied Charles Leclerc into pitting earlier. So Oscar Piastri was pitted on lap 9 from medium tyres, and then Leclerc followed suit to cover that off. Norris then went longer on his first stint until lap 14, and he had better pace, and they swapped him around with Piastri again. So Norris actually had better race pace anyway, and I think part of why he got the podium was the strategy. So if they didn't put Piastri on that strategy, I don't think McLaren would have got a podium in the first place. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, I think the only way you could have got Piastri on the podium would have been to deliberately compromise Norris's race, which there's no logic to that. He was the faster driver.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just another one of those frustrating things where, once again, in the World Championship era, no Australian driver on the podium at home, but close. Oscar Piastri with 4th place. A question now I'll take from Kenny Stoltz, who says, Leclerc and Hamilton both seem to struggle to adapt to car balance changes where Sainz thrives. Did Ferrari make the wrong call giving up Sainz, who delivers in precisely the situations where Leclerc struggles? Next year, will Ferrari be able to produce a car that will make both drivers happy? Well, I think they're still... Leclerc and Hamilton are both adaptable. I think Leclerc, as we discussed earlier, can get a little bit confused by some of these tyre challenges, the things that Sainz excels in. But Hamilton's a very sharp driver when it comes to that sort of thing. I certainly think it won't be a problem to produce a car that will suit both drivers. They're not super extreme in their driving style and their car demands. They do approach things slightly differently, but they're not polar opposites or anything. And no, I'm not going to say it's the wrong call to give up on Sainz, because I don't think they did give up on Sainz. I think they just believed in Lewis Hamilton a little bit more, which you can completely understand. But I do think Sainz is a loss, just because he's such a great driver to have around in any team. Certainly, I wouldn't question the decision. Lewis Hamilton, you have to consider an upgrade. The only area where arguably is on age. Well, that's not even arguable, is it? He is a chunk older than Sainz. But yeah, I think that'll work. But there will be days next year when Ferrari will probably think, do you know what, if we had Carlos in the car, this is the kind of weekend where we could have really done with him. I think that will happen. So after a question from Ollie Emerson, who says, aside from an exceptional performance from the two drivers, how much credit do Ferrari deserve for their strategy and pit stops? So often lamented for both in previous years, they were the class of the field today. Cheers, Ollie.
I would say that when you do things right, people don't really think you've done anything at all. And I think I'm paraphrasing Futurama there, actually. But genuinely, I think Ferrari didn't put a foot wrong today. And yeah, they deserve credit for that. And when you see other teams putting feet wrong, for example, Sauber, and you know, they didn't have the perfect pit stops today, you can really see how wrong it can go when you just don't do things the way they should be done. And in Formula One, it's quite hard to do that during a race condition. We also saw Red Bull with their issues. Mercedes had issues. So other teams really kind of... I wouldn't say drop the ball, that's a bit harsh, but other teams had like Sundays that weren't ideal today, and Ferrari really pulled it off. And it shows how much you have to do to get a 1-2 finish. I mean, it cannot be underestimated how much Red Bull are doing right week in, week out to maintain that level of performance. And Ferrari put in a Red Bull-esque performance today, I think. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, and I think part of the credit for that does go to Fred Vasseur. He's calmed everything down there in his just over a year in charge there, and yeah, converting that into a 1-2. There are times where you can imagine we'd be sat here on this podcast talking about a 1-2 that was thrown away by Ferrari. So really the strength was, as you say, they didn't do anything wrong. They nailed it when they needed to. Mark, a question from Nevin Knowles, who says, why does the Ferrari seem to not gain performance throughout quali? First in Bahrain and now in Australia. The car looks to be okay in Q1 and Q2, but didn't take the usual leap you would expect for Q3, with the drivers complaining about the front not being as strong. I saw they may have changed the setup from FP2 to move more performance to the rear. Is this the case, or simply outside factors such as temperature and wind throwing the car out of its window?
Hi, Nevin. Yeah, interesting set of questions. I think there's a lot going on there, actually. One of them is that the Ferrari has quite a wide sweet spot, so you tend to see them getting straight into it earlier than you see other cars. Even the Red Bull takes longer. The Mercedes, sometimes they don't find it at all. But the McLaren takes longer to get that sweet spot. Often takes all the sessions before they're anywhere near happy with it. Same with the Red Bull. The Ferrari is straight into it, so there's not as much headroom left to make it better at the end. I think that's one of the things that's going on. And yes, it has a certain way of using the tyres that it depends what the demands of a particular track are. But generally, the more grip you have, the more understeer you will get. So you have to keep rebalancing the car for that. So the Ferrari is not. It's got quite a nice slow corner balance. It's very good in the mechanical corners. And so there's not usually all that much to do. You just sort of take the strength that it's got and run with it. Really, it's slightly different in its traits to the other cars, and I think that's what you're seeing, rather than it being any reflection on the abilities of the people operating it.
And the next question from Lewis Murphy I'll take, who asks, is Danny Rick proving himself to be less of an option for Red Bull's senior team? Yuki Tsunoda looks comprehensively stronger than him in the V-Carb. Has his lack of adaptability stuck with him from his McLaren struggles? Yes, I think he is proving himself to be less of an option for Red Bull's senior team. He's not on a trajectory to be worth putting in there at the moment. Yes, Tsunoda does look comprehensively stronger than him. And yeah, I think the lack of adaptability is still there. He hasn't adapted well to these cars. And I think he's now edging towards a bit of a crisis point, because he was talking about, I think there's something wrong with this car. They've already gone over that car after Saudi with a fine-tooth comb and found a few little bits and pieces, albeit they said not enough to explain his qualifying deficit there. And I think Ricciardo might be in that point where he's like, oh no, if there's not something I can find, then it's probably me.
Yeah, I think far from, is he on a trajectory still to be in the Red Bull? I would say, is he on a trajectory still to stay in the RB?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. In fact, we've got a question now for Samarth on that from Lachlan Babbage, who says, as an Australian, it pains me to ask this, but what reason can you see to keep Daniel Ricciardo in a Red Bull affiliated seat next year? Watching his lack of pace compared to a teammate yet again is beginning to make me think he's drifting towards a small collection of drivers that could be seen as wasting a seat. I really do think a Liam Lawson or even an Isaac Hadjar could be doing a better job. Discuss.
Thanks. Oh, discuss. Nice.
Discuss,
Thanks,
yeah.
Lachlan. Yeah, well, I will discuss.
A full essay, please.
Talk.
I like it. Well, if you're part of the members club, I think it gives you free reign to say that. Fair enough. And yeah, it is a shame, actually. He seems a bit dented, his confidence as well. He seems, I wouldn't say resigned, but his body language is kind of getting there now, and he knows what's at stake. It's a long season, It's a long season, and there is time to turn it around. I'm sure he's definitely going to try. But this has been a less than ideal start to the season for Daniel Ricciardo. With Yuki Tsunoda performing so well, yeah, there's little case for him to stay. And actually, Mark, you just touched on that. Or you literally just said that, to be honest. And I think it was a very good point. Is there much of a case keeping him at RB? And Isaac Hadjar had a really good weekend in Formula 2, actually. So I think, he deserves a shout out for that. He was solid. Really solid. I mean, class of the field in the feature race, barely put a foot wrong. Yeah, he got a bit lucky with strategy because he had like a bit of a free pit stop during virtual safety car, but he was really solid, and his kind of mentality seems up there. I genuinely think he's a solid product. And of course, Liam Lawson's waiting in the wings there. I think it's a matter of time, basically, unfortunately. But at least you have Oscar Piastri.
That's good news for the Australian fans. Yeah, I think we are on the current trajectory. I think it's a question of when Ricciardo gets replaced by Lawson this season, not if. It can be changed, and it's not something I particularly want to see happening, but you can't justify keeping Daniel Ricciardo in that seat based on how good he was 5 years ago. And he was an outstanding Formula One driver. Maybe that's still in him again, but we're getting quite a big sample set of data across multiple cars, unfortunately. So he will know better than anyone that he needs to find the answer, and very, very quickly. Mark, a question from Gareth Coleman, who says, is Lewis Hamilton's current form starting to get concerning? Hamilton has started to consistently get outperformed by Russell since the start of the season, which on the surface looks concerning. Is this similar to 2022, where he was experimenting more with setup, or does Russell just have more pace in his car?
He is experimenting more with setup again, as he was in 22, not doing so much last year. So there is that. But you're right. He's, George has been the more consistently quick driver in qualifying, and it's got to be a concern. It's not. I'm not looking at it saying, "Oh, this is it. This is age catching up with him" or anything like that. But I think it's got to be a concern for Lewis and himself, because that question's always hanging about at the back of your mind as you get older. And he even said it in his interview with us last year. He said, you're only human. You do sometimes ask yourself, is it me? Or, is it really all the car, or is it me? So he will be asking himself those. But I'm sure there'll come a day where the car has given him all the messages he needs, and he's absolutely devastating, and all those doubts will just evaporate, and then he'll be off on another level again. But I think the further into your career you get, and the older you get, the more these things will tend to weigh on you. The normal, just the waves of form will sort of weigh down a little bit.
And it's very, very difficult to untangle any fluctuations there in the driver form when you're in a team that's fluctuating so much. And they've talked about having fluctuations from one side of the garage to the other
Yeah.
on race weekends over the past few years. So it's been really strange. I think the thing that's probably most telling is during qualifying they had the head-to-head, didn't they, of Hamilton to Russell. I think it's just a pure who qualifies better. We tend to discount ones where a fair comparison hasn't been made or someone's had a problem, but it's basically dead even, isn't it, between him and Russell over their stint as teammates. So it's far from the case that Russell's destroying him or anything, although he has out-qualified him all 3 times this season. So interesting to keep track of. Final question I'll take from Danny Elliott. Do you have any further thoughts on Albon's race today? Will the team be happy with 11th, considering a few usual top 10 finishers had DNFs, and that was a potential opportunity missed? Well, it's quite an interesting one. As we said earlier, Albon performed really well in that race, I think. I don't think there was much more. The pace wasn't there. So it was a potential opportunity missed, but because the car didn't have as much pace as it needed to make the most of that opportunity, the opportunity that was taken by RB and that was taken by Haas, who are the kind of natural enemies of Williams there. So the question there is, well, what's missing? And they struggled a bit with the tyres this weekend as well. So there's some things that will concern them about that car, on top of the fact they're a little bit behind with the development. Upgrades are going to be further delayed by the accident as well, and they need to build up more spares and get the chassis patched up. So I think that's what will worry them most about the potential opportunity. Not they can look at today and say, right, today we should have been in the points because we had the pace. It's more like, actually, this reflects the fact we're not quite as strong as we need to be to take advantage of these opportunities, and that could last for a few more races. Unfortunately, it's a long, hard road back for them, and it's going to be a tough battle in terms of points on the table for those bottom 5 teams, certainly on current form. Well, thanks as always to Samarth and Mark for your company. There'll be loads to read on our website as always, and I'll be speaking to Gary Anderson soon for another episode of the Race F1 Tech Show. Plus, we've got a load of YouTube videos in the pipeline for your viewing pleasure. But now we're making the long journey home from Australia, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.